Welcome back. I titled this section, Isn't It All Just Reading? Because I want to talk about why students may be experiencing digital texts different than printed texts. Because, of course, this class is all about how students may read those different formats differently, and then how we as teachers can be prepared to make sure they're successful no matter which format they're given. I think it helps to take a second to really define what we mean when we talk about what's involved in the experience of reading, or what we call literacy. Researchers in the field of literacy have for a long time argued that literacy goes beyond just the act of reading or writing. It's really a set of social practices, and those social practices are embedded in particular contexts, social and cultural contexts that give those practices meaning. So let's break that down for a second. Let's give an example. Think about the differences between writing an essay for school versus sending a text to a friend. They couldn't be more different, right? A school essay is typically formal. You have to put a title and a date at the top. You have to be careful about your spacing and your margins. You check your grammar and your spelling. And it's something we have to really talk to students about. We have to teach them that in the context of school, this is how we do writing. A text, on the other hand, is rarely a complete sentence. It's filled with acronyms and shortcuts, and you don't really worry too much about your spelling. Um, and it's something that kids also had to learn, and they typically learned it from their friends and from their social contexts. So both of these are examples of writing, but they're embedded in very different social contexts, one in the context of school and the other in the context of day-to-day activities. These are both literacy practices. They involve reading and writing, and they really can't be taken out of their social context. Um, in the same way, you have a set of expectations for each kind of text. You read them differently. So if you received a text, if you were a teacher and you received a text as an essay, you would say, no, that's going to get an F. Or if you were a friend and someone wrote you an essay length response with formal language, you would think, that's really weird. So when we think about literacy, we have to think about those social contexts that give them meaning. And we also have to broaden our concept of reading and writing to include texting and emailing and making videos and podcasts and Instagrams and Snapchats and all these things, because they're all examples of literacies and all examples of literacies in social contexts. And as it turns out, these social contexts will have a pretty big impact on how students experience digital or printed text. I'm going to return to my own study for just a second. As I mentioned in the overview, I studied my students' experiences reading digital and printed texts, and I asked them to reflect and discuss what it was like for them to read in these different formats. What I found when I looked at the data that I collected was that I could pretty easily group my students' responses into four sort of broad categories. And I used categories that were initially identified by a scholar and researcher called Max von Manen. And he did a lot of research about lived experience. And you can find a link to von Manen's website and to his research in the show notes. So von Manen talked about lived experience in for these four categories, and they're called life world themes. The first two are lived space and lived body. And when we think about lived space, we think about all those spaces that you read in, and how they feel, like how it feels to read when you're cozy in your bed versus when you're sitting in a library, and how different that experience can be. The second theme is the lived body, and those are the physical aspects of reading. And you may not think about that, but really reading can be very physical. You might really like the feeling of turning pages, of folding down a page or flipping to the back of the book to see what's going on, versus reading electronically, where it's an electronic version of flipping the page, or being able to turn the screen around so that the text changes orientation. Another area to think about in lived experience is lived time. And that's that sense of subjective time. Thinking about like how when you're doing something great, time flows by really, really quickly versus when maybe you're studying for a test and time seems to kind of stop. And the last thing is the lived other. And that's your relationship to other people when you read. And when you think about literacy as being in a social context, think about how you're socialized into reading. If you grew up in a family that had tons of books and you have been exposed to a lot of books, you may have one feeling about reading. If you grew up in a family that didn't do a lot of reading, or maybe you read nonfiction versus fiction. So thinking about how that relationship with other people affects your approach to reading. So each of these categories represented a pretty significant impact on how students experienced reading digital versus printed text. So in the next video, I'm going to walk through each one of these and give you some examples of my students' responses.